Yeah, and sorry about the technical limitations. Okay, so I've got 10 minutes, which is not very long, to talk to you about a very broad subject, which is parking policy. So I want to break this down into first looking at destination parking, so places that people go to, then residential parking. I'm going to talk about a complication which affects parking policy, and probably several of the other things that you will look at on transport. And finally, to talk about the implications of all this for decarbonisation, which is your main interest in this assembly. So, destination parking. The headline, if I were to pluck out one sort of big picture conclusion, is this: that the ease or difficulty of parking and its cost do influence how people travel. Generally speaking, more difficult or expensive parking causes people to drive less, but as with so many other things in transport, there is a complication. There's also quite a lot of traffic. It's been found is actually, particularly in cities and larger towns, is made up of people searching for parking spaces. Now, that tends to be worse where either on-street parking is cheaper than off-street parking. So that's a common problem. You know, the multi-storey car parks have got plenty of spaces, but they're more expensive, and people spend ages trying to drive around, find a cheaper space on the road. And or the other problem is that there are informal spaces here and there, and if you spend time driving around and looking, you might get somewhere for free. Finally, you may have heard a lot whenever changes to parking are ever proposed. There's always a sort of an outcry from you know, shopkeepers, business owners. The research evidence on that, it's not entirely complete, but what it does show is that those concerns are often exaggerated, and that shop owners often have distorted views about who the customers are, where they come from, and how they get there, and what influences why they shop. We at University of the West of England, we have done quite a bit of research into different aspects of travel behaviour, which include parking policy. And so we found in one of our studies, we found that it was the availability of parking which had the biggest single influence on commuting behaviour in employment sites to the north of Bristol. Secondly, the extension of residential parking zones around the central areas of cities can be quite effective in causing some car commuters to switch. Obviously, the boundaries of the residential parking zones are important, because you can get, depending on how they're drawn, you can get problems of people then parking right on the edge.
Okay, Steve, we've lost you there. Steve, are you still there? Frozen at our end, Steve. Steve, do you want to try switching off your video and just running on audio? Oh, okay, he's back again. Okay. Sorry about this, folks. Just Steve's having some broadband challenges.
Yeah, sorry about that. Where was I up to when I cut out?
That's a very good question, because you froze quite early. So if you could start from maybe extension of residential parking, and then we'll go from there.
Right. Okay.
Steve, can I suggest that you just switch your camera off, and then that might help you?
Yeah, where's the camera button? Right. Okay, so the extension of residential parking zones around the inner city areas can help to switch some car commuters to other modes. Having said that, the boundaries of residential parking zones are important, because depending on how widely they are drawn, you may get problems of lots of people trying to park on the edge of them and either walk in or take public transport or whatever. We did a study at our own university looking at the behaviours of students in particular, and we found that removing the parking rights from students not only reduced their driving to campus, but also had quite wide-ranging impacts on the whole of their travel behaviour, including car ownership and how many of them had got driving licenses. The biggest change that provoked was a switch from driving to taking the bus. I don't know whether park and ride schemes have featured in any of the suggestions in this so far. If they do, I would urge great caution. Because as you can see from this video, which has been made by one of my colleagues who did his PhD in this area, contrary to sort of popular belief, the conventional park and ride schemes in Britain, the idea of, you know, you build a big car park on the edge of a town or city and you run a load of buses into the centre, that actually increases total traffic mileage. It doesn't reduce it. So, I mean, there may be various reasons why people are interested in park and rides, but decarbonisation and climate change should not be amongst those reasons. Now, moving on to residential parking, again, the next sort of big headline point is this: car ownership is the biggest contributor to car use, and reduced residential parking can and sometimes does reduce car ownership. And like everything else in transport, it always comes with a but. In this case, that only works in areas where parking is effectively controlled. Otherwise, if you try to reduce parking, but you don't control it, guess what happens? I'm sure you can work that out for yourselves. So that's a very rapid overview of some of the main issues in destination and residential parking. I just want to flag up, I haven't got time to go into all these, but just to flag up 4 other issues that you might want to bear in mind when you're thinking about parking policy. One, firstly, that the revenue from parking charges can be used to help support other measures. I mean, contrary to what you might read in certain newspapers, parking charges are not used and cannot be used to send councillors on cruises to the Caribbean. They do have to be ring-fenced for transport purposes, and so that might be one of the factors that you want to bear in mind. Secondly, there is sometimes the potential to reallocate street space. Showing you an example there, an informal shop that has taken out some parking spaces and is using them for that purpose. There are many other things that can be done. You can see cycle parking, which is often a problem in sort of denser areas. You can take relatively small amounts of car parking, can provide for quite a lot of cycle parking in those places. And then finally, I gather you're not going to be talking very much about electrification, but you might just want to think about how parking policy might be used to support the electrification of the vehicle fleet. So, you know, on-street charging points, is it a good idea to reserve certain parking spaces for electric vehicles only? Now, there is a further complication which applies to parking policies. It does to probably most of the things that you're likely to look at, and that is the problem of suppressed demand. Right, to put it simply, anything you do which takes a car off the road liberates a space for somebody else to take that place. And that has been observed to happen in lots of places. So if you are, particularly if you've got roads which are congested, which tends to indicate that there are more people wanting to drive than are able to drive, anything you do, and that could be, say, a workplace parking levy, it could be an improvement to public transport. If there is nothing to stop additional vehicles from taking that place, then that's what they're likely to do. So you may find on its own, any one of these measures appears to be ineffective. So to conclude, I should mention here, by the way, that I lived in rural Devon for 15 years before I moved to Bristol city centre. So I've seen these transport questions from all angles. There are particular issues in a rural county like Devon. Some of the things that I've been talking to you about are only really applicable in urban areas. So on their own, I don't think that parking measures are likely to make much difference to carbon in a rural county like Devon. However, like many of the things you will be looking at, there are many of them that don't make much difference on their own. But when they are all used together in a complementary way, the whole is often bigger than the sum of the parts. So think about how all these things join together when you come up with your recommendations. Thanks very much.